Drawing inspiration from the Fitzwilliam Digger exhibition, we began to think about the way in which friendship works in private space and in public space. And the Au Café painting is a great example of women in late 19th century France entering public space. That is a particularly vexed issue in the 19th century, in France, in the UK, in all sorts of countries, because of what was called the theory of separate spheres, the idea that private and public space should be kept radically separate, and that women could not be allowed to appear alone in public space. And in that context, Au Café is clearly a highly provocative painting. We can track the way in which women enter the public sphere in the late 19th century by looking at literature, by looking at novels, and this is really the role that I had in our project, looking at realist novels by writers like Zola and Guy de Maupassant, and asking to what extent are these writers simply reflecting the social reality of contemporary France, or to what extent do these writers imagine women pushing into the public sphere, into the world of heterosociability, into a world where their relationships with men were not simply defined by family, romance, love. One of the great things that you can do with your own research project is to use the ideas of other scholars, other thinkers, and to try and push things on to the next level. We were really interested in Sedgwick's ideas about homosociability, but then we started to become more and more fascinated by the fourth term in our matrix of homo, hetero, social and sexual. And in particular, we started to talk a lot about what we could call heterosociability, relations between men and women which might not be simply romantic, amorous, familial or sexual. One of the things that we came to understand as we talked about the project was the need for a vocabulary of sexual identity that would allow us to discuss these questions of gender fluidity and human relationships in a coherent fashion. And in fact, the late 19th century had its own vocabulary of sexual identity that is linked to our own vocabulary of sexual identity, but not identical to it. So the late 19th century had its own vocabulary of sexual identity that we will recognise, even though it's not exactly the same as our own necessarily. By the end of the 19th century, thinkers were talking and writing about human sexuality in terms of homosexuality and heterosexuality, both terms coming from Greek origins, homo meaning the same, and hetero meaning different or other.